Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am Huri Berberian, Professor of History, Merouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and Director of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of California at Irvine. On behalf of the Center for Armenian Studies and our co-sponsors, the UCI Department of History and UCI Global Middle Eastern Studies, welcome. Today's panel, inspired by the recently published edited collection, Age of Rogues, Rebels, Revolutionaries, and Racketeers at the Frontiers of Empires, is part of the Vahe and Armine Merouni lecture series. Thanks to the Merounis and our donors and supporters here in Southern California and throughout the US and the globe. I would like to thank my co-panelists, Ramazan Hakko and Alp Yenen, both co-editors of the volume, and Toygun Altantash, author of one of the chapters, for joining me today from the Netherlands, from Turkey, and from Germany. Starting next quarter, barring any unforeseen circumstances, we will warmly welcome you back in person to our public events, while continuing to record and post them on our YouTube channel. And this webinar will also be recorded and posted on the YouTube channel as well. I will introduce Dr. Alp Yenen, who will be our first speaker. And then after his presentation, he will take over introductions, since I too am a co-panelist, and it would be odd if I introduced myself. And he has also kindly agreed to join me in moderating the Q&A after our presentations. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions. Please make your questions clear and concise and on the themes explored by our panelists. And thank you in advance for doing that. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alp Yenen. He is an assistant professor at Leiden University Institute for Area Studies. Previously, he was a research associate and senior resident at the University of Basel and a doctoral fellow of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. He holds a PhD from the University of Basel and an MA degree from the University of Munich. He has published in journals such as Contemporary European History, Die Welt des Islams, sorry for my pronunciation, and Middle Eastern Studies on the comparative and connected history of the end of the Ottoman Empire. Currently, he is preparing a book on the international history of the Young Turk movement in the aftermath of the First World War under contract with Columbia University Press, and I'm looking very much forward to that book. Moreover, he is also interested in the cultural legacies of transgressive politics. He has a forthcoming article in Comparative Studies in Society and History on the contentious narratives of martyrdom and revenge after the assassination of Talat Pasha by Solomon Tehlirian. He is going to speak today on conceptualizing the age of rogues. Please, Dr. Yenen.
Thank you, Huri. So let me start my screen sharing. So, is it working? Yes, good. So, I would like to thank Professor Huri Berberian and the institutions and sponsors of the University of California, Irvine, for this generous invitation to host a book talk on the age of rogues, rebels, revolutionaries, and racketeers at the frontiers of empires. So this is the book, and I believe Ramazan will post the link for the book for those of you who are interested to look it up and also purchase it, perhaps. I had the pleasure of co-editing this volume together with Ramazan Hakko, and the volume includes contributions by Jack Goldstone, Huri Berberian, Jeronim Perovic, Olma Girls, Anna Vakali, Toygun Altantash, Ilkay Yilmaz, Alina Schlepfer, Benjamin Fortner, Michael Provence, Jordi Tegel, and Eric Jan Zurcher. And many thanks also to Edinburgh University Press. So when Ramazan and I set out to write the introduction chapter to our edited volume, one thing was clear for both of us, that we didn't want to write a typical introduction, kind of a typical introduction to an edited volume. It's commonly reduced to two simple objectives. One is to stating the relevance of the book, and the other one is the summarizing the chapters one after another. Instead, we wanted to come up with a proper conceptual framework, and this was, of course, an ambitious undertaking. And I hope you will enjoy it. And this is what I will try to explain today in my talk: conceptualizing the age of rogues. For those of you who are interested, it ended up being a 50 pages long introduction, so it's just, went a little bit overboard, perhaps. So the first question is, when was this age of rogues which we're talking about? At the opening of our chapter, we describe what we call age of rogues in very general terms. So we describe it in a kind of what would occur in an age of rogues, and indicate at the end that it could even refer to a contemporary conflict, such as the civil war in Syria or elsewhere. So this is we use the term in a general way. And this is by purpose, as we do not claim that there was the age of rogue that was singular or unique in any sense. Hence, we acknowledge that there might be other periods in history that might qualify as an age of rogues. Therefore, we say that this book will take its readers to an age of rogues in the history that is neither near nor far back to the turn of the 20th century. So this means we have settled for a certain particular context in history. This particular context, which we were interested in, starts in the second half of the 19th century, when modernity created its own disillusionment, which was part of the fin de siècle pessimism at the end of the 19th century. But the turn of the century, at the same time, also and also the Belle Époque, the so-called Belle Époque, were also a time of rising expectations for many people, and it was a rising life standards and a change in life and lifestyles. And this era culminated, however, in the cataclysm of the Great War, with all its triumphs and its traumas, and gave way to the extremes of the interwar period. This is roughly the time frame we are interested in. Other historians have called this time frame age of imperialism, age of nationalism, age of steam and print, age of coexistence, or age of genocide. In designating their time as this time as an age of rogues, however, we are not proposing yet another periodization of this sort that may project a singular, linear, or enclosed time frame. For us, then, is age of rogues less a temporality than a genre of politics that very much emerge out of these entangled historical processes. So it does not contradict an age of empire or age of nationalism, age of coexistence and genocide. It is part of this altogether. And in defining the age of rogues, we came up with this, Ramazan and I, we defined the age of rogues as a particular geopolitical and historical context within which imperial rivalries gave birth to a cast of parapolitical and paramilitary agents whose violent autonomy and culture of transgression managed to transform the legitimate norms of politics and the formal institutions of state sovereignty. This means we are interested in how the macro struggles of empires and great powers interact with local agents and local agents of violence, and how this shaped the cultures and structures of power through means of violence. So this is what we were interested in. So, and the next question which we dealt, and also a certain portion of the introduction is devoted, is about where to locate the age of rogues. So where is the age of rogues? And here we find our own age of rogues at the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire, where we claim the way of contentious politics played out shaped the shaky foundations upon which the modern Balkans, Middle East, and Caucasus were forged. But again, one can easily locate an age of rogues in the very same period, for instance, in Mexico or in China, that were going through their very own revolutionary processes. So this is something also one needs to consider. But what we are looking into is the frontiers of the Ottoman Empire. And as such, centering our age of rogues at the frontiers of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and now these frontiers are in the Balkans to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the Caucasus with the Russian Empire, and also in the Middle East and the Caucasus, the Qajar Persian Empire. And then we have also, of course, the French and British colonial empires, and in that period in North Africa. So we consider these regions of Middle East, including North Africa, of course, the Balkans and the Caucasus, as a connected region in form of a greater frontier of empires, and that is shaped very much by the Eastern question and by the Great Game. And in framing this vast geography as a frontier, and this is the term which we settled for, so we came up with so that this is actually the most useful term for our purposes, which we decided. We take both the multilateral or bilateral dimensions and the unilateral dimensions into consideration. Because frontier is a concept of intersubjective boundary making. It is a subjective term. And in its bilateral dimension, which is common in continental European usage, for instance, in French, a frontier corresponds to what have been variously called as shatter zones or borderlands among more or less equal empires. So it's a border zone among empires, between empires. But there is also a unilateral sense of the concept, and this is, I think, more common in the American usage of the term, where frontier is unilateral. It has only one direction, and it's the site of civilizational mission, and it's the site of colonial conquest or settlement in territories that are not seen as sovereign or integrated or equal. Or this can be also internal peripheries within the empire, perhaps not even close to the border regions, but territories that are similarly subordinated to state formation and civilizational mission and centralization, regardless of the local conditions. And in the Ottoman Empire, much like elsewhere, these dimensions of frontiers were intricately linked to one another. In exemplifying what we mean as a frontier of empires, in the chapter, in the introduction chapter, we illustrate the case study of the Macedonian question from the Berlin Congress of 1878 to the Constitutional Revolution of 1908. And this section was penned most by Ramazan, if I may admit, so I will not elaborate any further on this case study as such, but we could have also taken the case of the Armenian question, for instance, in the very same period, and certainly extending it to the World War and the Armenian genocide and the interwar period, as a typical setting of the age of rogues at the frontiers of empires. So the next question which we dealt with Ramazan in our introduction is, of course, the question of who are these rogues whom we are talking about, and here, just like frontier, the term rogue is a metaphorical concept. It's a word that is accessible in all our vocabulary, and it's a word which we mean to give a new meaning in our analytical purposes. So, and as such, we propose the term rogue because it is an inclusive concept that not only signifies capability of transgression. This is the main marker for us, the capability of transgression, but it denies any pre-configured historical consequence. So, heroes could be both heroes and villains, rebels and rulers, revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. And this proves for us to be a very useful term, because if we have called them revolutionaries, some of them were counter-revolutionaries. If we have called them, let's say, rebels, some of them became bureaucrats or rulers later on. So this transition is more possible with a term like rogues. So the inclusiveness of the term rogues allows us to also comprehend well better the social mobility that is typical of the frontiers of empires. So, and this is something way more established in the literature, of course, that one could go from being a bandit to a rebel, from economic interest to political interest, from a rebel to an irregular, a paramilitary of the government co-opted by the state, or from an irregular to a warlord who is more or less autonomous, and then from warlord being back to bandit and vice versa. So all these transitions are witnessed in the history of the Ottoman Empire and its frontiers, and the term rogue enables us to capture these. So it helps us, the rogue trajectories, we can put them into where subversion and coercion are within a framework of continuity and connection. This was very important for us. So, but not only in remote and rural regions, which we consider typical frontiers, but also in the frontiers of modernity and tradition, in the microcosms of urban spaces and neighborhoods, we observe in this very period the emergence of mafia-like protection rackets and invention of traditions of hegemonic masculinity. And these famous figures, these mafia bosses called in Turkish kabadaya or in Arabic kabadai or kulhambe, or in the Persian context, we have this kind of these luti groups, this kind of the strongman of the bazaar, of the neighborhoods, or the cult of the Javan Mard in the Persian context of the young manliness. So this is something very peculiar of this process, and I think we believe that it also contributes to the rogues and their habitus as such. And this is also a time where politics of the ancien regimes were increasingly vulnerable to new type of urban warfare and their new technologies that was marked by assassination plots against state heads and other officials, as well as to sabotage and terror attacks against state and civilian targets. So this is a time that was marked by these cases. And at the center of our age of rogues, we have we focus on a new type of agents of organized violence that combines all these different forms of transgression. They are commonly called in this geography komitacı or komitacı. So this is kind of a committee man. Or sometimes they're called chetnik or cheta in different languages. We have the term fedai, of course, which was very popular among Turks, Armenians, Arabs, and Kurds. And then the term anjuman in the Persian context is which connotates the committee, the political committee. So on the one hand, we have this rural repertoire, which is based on formation of small units of brigands and the elaboration of tactics of irregular warfare and mobilization strategies of peasants, which were adopted by these new political committees. And on the other hand, we have new urban repertoire, which is combined the organizational features of secret societies and political parties with the tactics of terrorism and propaganda of deed. However, also combined with social movement tactics of mobilizing workers and students and others. So this is a combination that is quite remarkable in our eyes. So from banditry to insurgency, from paramilitarism to counterinsurgency, from terrorism to coup d'etats, rogues were shaping the politics of this particular era. And as a biographical case study of a rogue, we featured in our introduction Ismail Enver as a rogue par excellence of this particular era. And because if you look into what Enver, how Ismail Enver became the Enver Pasha, so starting as an ambitious counterinsurgency officer fighting against Macedonian revolutionaries, he joined the Committee of Union and Progress. He became the much celebrated hero of the Constitutional Revolution because he revolted against the rule of the Sultan in 1908. And he commanded later commando operations in Libya against Italian occupation in 1911 and became the Minister of War after a coup d'etat and it became the generalissimo of the Ottoman army during World War I. And then he tried to incite anti-colonial revolutions in the Muslim world through his call for a holy war. But meanwhile, also fought against other revolutionaries whom he considered now as his enemy, although they were practically very similar to him in their origins: Arab revolutionaries, Armenian revolutionaries, and this, in the way the latter culminated in the Armenian genocide of 1950. And when we say rogues, we are speaking of actors like were able to exert political influence beyond their status and beyond their mandate, commonly through means of violence against the norms and conventions of their time, across international borders and in times of global upheaval at the nexus of empire and revolution. So the question is, of course, what is transgressive politics? So unlike frontiers and rogues, which were metaphorical concepts, Ramazan and I have developed also this analytical concept as a neologism, which we named transgressive politics. So we locate transgressive politics at the intersections of three spheres of political analysis. So, and these spheres are mostly unrelated to each other. So this is are studied separately. So the first one is, of course, the conventional politics as such, which is kind of public institutions and questions of governance. So the second field of research that is also very more established now in the recent years is the field of contentious politics, that is about popular collective claim making, so social movements, protest movements, and so forth. So this is the field of contentious politics. And there is the third group, which is the field of parapolitics. This is, I believe, the least studied of them. That is about clandestine, conspiratorial, and subverting forms of politics. It could be intelligence services, it could be terrorism, it could be deep state structures, it could be organized crime. And this is where we situate transgressive politics, where agents and structures are involved in making violent and public actions to contend or defend the conventions of former politics through extraordinary and extra-legal means. And this is, of course, a research agenda. So this is also not complete as such. And as a research agenda, we discuss in our introduction the dynamics of transgression. And many of the contributions in our volume have addressed several of these dynamics. So, and they have done this by mapping spaces of transgression, so-called frontiers, as dynamic and complex settings. And this is probably best demonstrated in Toygun Altıntaş's chapter on Sasun district in Ottoman Armenia. And, or by casting agency beyond the state versus non-state, empire versus nation binaries. So we need to move beyond these binaries in casting agency. And what we need to do is crisscross macro and micro interrelationships. That means interstate relations matter as much as intergroup relations, as they are, and they are both interrelated with one another. And there are certain things which the contributions in our volume have addressed, and these are that subversion and coercion are connected and in interaction with one another in shaping politics and identities. This is important. And whether in subversion or coercion, violence is a form and not a degree of political interaction. And the power of parastatehood and illicit economies is what lies underneath the tip of the iceberg in case of failing states and armed conflicts. And this is something we need to keep in mind. And as part of this research agenda, we have also discussed in our introduction the so-called kind of culture of transgression that emerge out of these interrelated conflicts. Contributions in our volume have explored multiple ways to tackle these issues. Global and local frames of sense-making are very important, of course, but contributions in our volume consciously move beyond intellectual history as an end in itself. Instead, we have explored how transgressions are perceived and represented through ideologies, and how other unconventional flows of ideas such as intelligence reports, public discourse, and popular rumors shape transgressive interactions. Several of chapters have explored autobiographical or biographical narratives and complex life trajectories to demonstrate how transgressive actors have redefined themselves in different contexts against the conventions of their time. And among many, Ramazan Öztan's chapter on Bulgarian bombmaker Tüfekçiyev comes to mind. And finally, many contributions studied the culture and sociology of extra-legal autonomy and authority. Here, there are some key elements that were addressed in the contributions in the book. We need to critically deconstruct sacralization of transgression and sacralization of violence, and also deconstruct the heroization and demonization of rogue figures. Second, at a micro level, the cult of secrecy, cult of fraternity, and the leadership cult needs attention to understand the intra-group conflicts and rivalries. And last but not least, we have to keep in mind that such an age of rogues is commonly dominated by men and their idealized notions of hegemonic masculinity. Hence, a critical look at the gendered order and the gendered violence that accompanies transgressive politics is crucial, as several contributions have demonstrated, especially Olma Girls and, of course, Suri Barbarians chapters. So, to come to a conclusion, as much as we had an initial idea, of course, the introduction grew while the other chapters were also being written. So the review and revision process help us, Ramazan and me, to finalize our concepts. And we hope that other historians will find it useful for their purposes. One must also credit the excellent work of others who have inspired and accompanied our work while we were crafting the Age of Rogues. Ours is certainly not a pioneering work, but an interim assessment of a maturing and growing field of research from very different perspectives, and also proposal on how to move forwards from here and approach similar episodes elsewhere and elsewhere. And to come to the final slide here, I want to finish with the cover of the book, for which we use this painting by German artist Franz Marc from Munich. And he painted this picture titled The Wolves in 1913 to depict the violence of the Balkan Wars, a war which, according to Franz Marc, was driven by packs of wolves on all frontiers. Thank you very much. I am stopping now my screen.
Thank you all very much for that great introduction to the volume and to the panel.
So if I may, I will take over the moderation here and give the floor to you, dear Huri. So I think the one person who does not need introduction is Professor Huri Barbarian. But nevertheless, I will of course introduce her and her great and very inspiring work. Huri Barbarian is a professor of history, Mekruni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and director of the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her books include the co-edited book with Turay Darai, Reflections on Armenian Identity in History and Historiography, published 2018, and the two single-authored monographs, which are also very much connected to each other and complement each other. The first one, published in 2001, Armenians and the Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1905-1911, in quotation marks, the love for freedom has no fatherland, that's the slogan. And most recently, and this is, I think, a major contribution to our field and an inspiring work for all of us, Roving Revolutionaries, Armenians and the Connected Revolutions in the Russian, Iranian, and Ottoman Worlds, published in 2019. Roving Revolutionaries was the co-recipient of the Dr. Sona Aronian Book Prize for Excellence in Armenian Studies, and the Mogadichian Society for Armenian Studies Outstanding Book Award in 2019, and shortlisted for the Central Eurasian Studies Society Book Award in History and Humanities in 2020. Dear Horia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alp. So I shall begin. A 131-page report issued by the Ottoman Special Commission investigating the attempted assassination of Sultan Abdulhamid II in 1905 describes Rubina, nom de guerre of Sophie Areshian, who helped to plan and carry out this act of political violence as, quote, Armenian, originally from the Caucasus, 32 years old, hysterical, short, skinny, brown, large black eyes, vague look, rather pronounced and hooked nose, thin bloodless lips, oval chin, speaks Russian, Armenian, and very little German, end quote. Similar depictions of Rubina, who was actually 24 at the time of the attack, as hysterical, prone to nervousness, and easily distressed, are echoed in contemporary accounts by her own male comrades. Some comrades even attempted to blame her for the failed assassination, citing the unsuitability of her crisis-prone character. How are we to understand these kinds of depictions? Was the falling back on old tropes of the hysteria of women as a way to address a transgressive woman, a rogue, who defied and contradicted contemporary gender norms? Were these depictions a way to make sense of what must have challenged deeply ingrained notions of gender propriety and expectations? After all, as other politically violent women, Rubina too acted outside of the typical gender role, and therefore faced critical scrutiny not only for her behavior, but also for her gender transgression. Given that nationalist politics is a masculinist enterprise, where a culture of manliness is reflected in and entwined with themes of courage, honor, and patriotism, and where women's place has, for the most part, been appropriated to reproducers, either biological or cultural, Rubina's deed may be viewed as a transgressive and challenging act that has been depicted in gender terms. In this study, I argue that Rubina's portrayal has produced a highly gendered narrative at the cost of appreciating her truly revolutionary role, not only in the conventional sense of her participation in a revolutionary act of terror, but also revolutionary and transgressive in terms of her gender. Furthermore, I seek to insert Rubina's story into the larger Armenian revolutionary narrative, as well as the broader context of turn-of-the-century revolutionary terror, a predominantly masculine world of revolution and an age of rogues. Rubina was born in 1881 into a wealthy landowning Russian-speaking family in Tiflis, today's Tbilisi, an Armenian cultural and intellectual hub at the time. Rubina experienced her roaring 20s in the roaring Caucasus, a crossroads of revolutionary ideas, migrants, laborers, and political activists. In 1901, she began teaching at a school for oil workers in Baku. There, in 1903, she met at least two of her future comrades and co-conspirators, Christopher Mikhaelian, co-founder of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, ARF, and the brains behind the assassination attempt, and Safo, Martiros Margarian, who led the regicide attempt after Mikhaelian's death. According to Rubina's own account, her initial meeting with Mikhaelian was eye-opening, as she learned for the first time about the plight of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and the work of the ARF, which had taken up their cause. She writes, I quote, "I was shaken. All this was a new world for me," end quote. When she heard about Operation Najuik, Courser, the code name for Sultan Abdulhamid, she expressed her commitment to join the mission. She must have left an impression on Mikhaelian, who months later called her to Athens via telegram. She left Baku, passing through several places, including Greece, where apparently she became an excellent shot. In Athens, she also became Rubina Fine, daughter of Jewish merchant Samuel Fine, one of Mikhaelian's pseudonyms. Rubina and Mikhaelian used these pseudonyms throughout the operation. She arrived in Constantinople in 1904. The act of regicide came after months of preparations, including surveillance of the site surrounding the Yıldız Mosque and the Sultan's movements during the Friday prayer ceremony, Selamlık. According to the committee responsible for the terror act, this meant dozens of visits by Rubina and others to the actual site, calculating the Sultan's steps and the time it took down to the second for him to walk from the mosque to his carriage. They also imported explosive apples, that is hand-thrown bombs, clocks, electrical parts, melanite, that's picric acid, and other components from Varna on the Black Sea coast to Constantinople, often with transactions with smugglers and arms dealers such as Tüfekçiyev, about whom you'll hear from Dr. Öztan. Experiments with explosives in remote parts of Bulgaria killed two comrades, Mikhailyan and Vramshabu Kendilyan. On the eve of the attack, Rubina, along with her comrades, prepared the explosives. The next day, they were loaded onto the carriage. On the morning of the 21st of July, 1905, they stopped for flowers for Rubina, likely as a cover. Then they went to the carriage. Against Sappho's objections, Rubina had brought a pair of scissors with her. Her objective, to remain in the carriage and cut the conducting wires in case the timer did not function, to render the explosion instantaneous and in the process sacrifice her own life. Sappho, however, considered it, quote, useless and superfluous, end quote. Zare, a coachman, drove the carriage transporting Rubina, holding a bouquet of flowers, carrying a hidden revolver in case she was stopped, and watching over a portion of the hundreds of kilos of melanite that had been smuggled into the capital. They rode to the Yıldız Mosque, parked the carriage in the visitors' parking area under the clock tower, and Rubina waited for the Sultan to come out of prayers. The clock neared the fateful moment of 12:43 and 36 seconds. Rubina set off the timers for the explosives 1 minute, 24 seconds before disembarking the carriage. That was the time, according to precise calculations, that it would take for the Sultan to reach his own coach, where he would be killed by the explosion from the infernal carriage, to Jochain Gak. Rubina and her comrades left the site believing, according to their own testimony, that their deed had the intended result and only discovered by telegram the next day after they had already reached Sofia, Bulgaria, that while dozens of mostly civilians and some 50 horses had been killed, the courser, Mujrik, lived. The Sultan had lingered in conversation with the Sheikh al-Islam and had been spared. What followed were the arrests, trials, and sentencing of dozens of co-conspirators, discovery of the accoutrement of terror, as well as acrimonious deliberations by the ARF to try to work out how and why things had gone wrong. Rubina, along with others, was sentenced to death in absentia and became a pawn in the hands of her detractors, trying to elude blame. Rubina's role in attempted regicide was crucial, not only to the act itself, but also to its planning, its consequent recriminations, and more broadly in the context of women's participation in acts of revolutionary terror. Most of Rubina's male comrades, contemporaries, and those who came after, as well as the Ottoman Special Commission, consistently portrayed her not as a revolutionary equal to her male comrades or counterparts, but as a young woman or girl to be handled delicately, much like the explosives she detonated. According to the Ottoman Special Commission, Rubina was guilty not only of participating, quote, in the preparation of the criminal enterprise, but also of lending herself as an inspired virgin to the attempts of the organizers to garner followers, to excite revolutionary ideas, and to stimulate the activity of the members of the committee, end quote. This is quite a provocative interpretation that views Rubina's power deriving directly from her presumed virginity or purity, which serves to inspire, excite, and stimulate men into revolutionary action. Armenian sources, while not directly addressing her virginity, have nevertheless often referred to her as Miss Oriot, designating her unmarried status and therefore her assumed virginity. Allusions to her purity are not surprising given the emphasis placed on women's honor and their place in nationalist discourse. Others have focused on Rubina's motivations for her commitment to nation and revolution. An article titled Rubina, the Patriotic Girl, published in 1971 after her death at age 90, describes Rubina's transformation from, quote, a delicate, delightful, cheerful, slender, and coquettish, end quote, girl, to a patriot who put aside her, quote, spoiled fancies, end quote, and committed herself to the operation with the intent of sacrificing her life, but not for political or ideological reasons. According to the author, who seems to take special delight in the dramatic, Rubina, quote, the poor girl, mad from grief, has decided to die because Christopher, Mikhailian, is no more, end quote. Having witnessed Mikhailian die violently with, quote, pieces of flesh falling from the sky, end quote, Rubina, quote, hardened and with revenge in her heart, takes an oath to carry out the Sultan's assassination attempt personally, end quote. The somewhat common ascription of a personal instead of a political reason for revolutionary terror and for self-sacrifice privileges personal factors behind women's choices, factors that are primarily emotional, obsessive, even pathological. We encounter references to her zeal for self-sacrifice in other places too, as part of her perceived general hysterical disposition. According to one of Rubina's comrades, Ashton, Rubina insisted on being in the carriage and having the responsibility for detonating the explosives. She objected to drawing lots for that position. According to Yerikian, she went from imploring and crying to becoming indignant, demanding, angry, and threatening. Sappho too avows her commitment, stating, quote, I knew very well that she was devoted, she was prepared to die, end quote. What is puzzling, however, is not that Rubina, as a revolutionary and transgressive historical actor, was prepared to sacrifice herself, but that her zeal was portrayed by her male comrades as troubling and at times even irritating. Furthermore, we are prompted to accept that despite her supposed fit and maniacal behavior, portrayed very much like a child's temper tantrum in the sources, comrades handed this purportedly hysterical woman the metaphorical keys to the carriage for what was to be one of the gravest and most consequential acts of political violence taken on by the party, the assassination of an imperial sovereign. Rubina was very much aware of these depictions of her. Sappho, the leader of the operation after Mikhailian's death, seems to have been the originator of the gendered narrative about Rubina. Although Sappho found her, quote, fearless and selfless, end quote, he cited her, quote, severe nervous sickly system, end quote, and deemed her threatening to the operation. Thus, Sappho claimed, it, quote, it was enough for Christopher to be uttered in her presence for her to faint, end quote. Moreover, he stated that he had been pressured to have Rubina resume work on the project in June 1905 by ARF co-founder Rostom and other comrades, adding that, quote, she would die, end quote, if not called back. There's no doubt that Mikhailian's death shook Rubina. In a letter, Rubina explains that fateful day as, quote, the most terrible day of my life, end quote. After all, she witnessed the explosion and consequent death of her comrades, especially her Hayrik, Papa in Armenian, as she often referred to Mikhailian. As she recounts, she heard the explosion and, quote, beside the slowly rising smoke, I saw nothing and no one, end quote. She somehow reached Mikhailian's side and in her, quote, mad cry of Hayrik, she saw him open and close his eyes 3 times. She could not see his wound and could not appreciate the gravity of his situation. It became clear later that a small piece of shrapnel had lodged in his heart and another in his hip. Fully aware of the enormity of the danger to themselves and the operation if authorities were to find their explosive contraband, Rubina was entrusted with hastening to their hotel and before the search by authorities could begin, cleaning out the rooms and transferring all the suitcases with bombs to the residence of Macedonian revolutionary and ARF collaborator Boris Sarapov. And yet, Sappho and some other comrades still considered her unable to act under pressure. The Responsible Committee's report, written by Sappho, his letters, the ARF's investigation into the failed assassination, especially the discussions at the Fourth General Congress, March to April 1907, provide us with essential clues about not only how Rubina was branded, but also how she challenged the narrative developing about her. Because of time, I will only focus here on Rubina's own statement when she was given an opportunity to present her story. She began with her arrival in September 1904 to Constantinople. One of her first acts was to go to the Friday prayer ceremony with Mikhailian. Watching from the terrace where European visitors stood, Mikhailian and she discussed the plan to employ small, round, hand-thrown bombs, precursors to the grenade. A carriage was not in the picture. Sappho stood against that method from the start, citing various reasons. What perplexed Rubina most, however, was Sappho's insistence that there should be, quote, no superfluous sacrifice, end quote. She stated, I quote, I was astonished. How could one be a revolutionary and be afraid of sacrifice and not take advantage of all positions available? Here, Rubina is accusing Sappho of cowardice. By doing so, she is turning the tables on him and challenging his masculinity and even his devotion to the Armenian nation. And in contrast, presenting herself as the one, quote, prepared for every sacrifice, end quote. As scholars have argued, concepts like honor, patriotism, cowardice, bravery are intimately tied to the nation and to manliness. Thus, Rubina juxtaposes her honor, patriotism, and courage, read masculine, with Sappho's dishonorable timidity, read feminine. It is possible that her engagement with and use of masculinist and nationalistic tropes, such as courage versus cowardice, sacrifice versus timidity, patriotism versus fear, was itself a way to take control over the gendered constructions and narratives, and itself a revolutionary and transgressive political act. In conclusion, nearly everything of the little that is known about Rubina is written either by contemporary detractors who have in hindsight constructed a particularly gendered narrative and nationalist discourse. Thus, in a sense, Rubina's involvement and leadership in the act of revolutionary terror are considered outside the conventional parameters of not only gender norms and expectations, but also of a masculine vision of a nation. Rubina's voice only surfaces in statements during the General Congress and a few letters in which, at the behest of others, she recounts her revolutionary days. After the failed assassination, Rubina recuperated in Geneva. In 1908, she moved to Constantinople. Starting in 1909, she followed the transfers of imprisoned comrades, including her husband-to-be, Hamo Ohanjanyan, across the South Caucasus and sought to assist them despite Russian intentions to imprison her. When she was arrested, her brother Mikhail Aresyan, a Russian military officer who later became a commander of the Armenian volunteer units in the Russian army during the First World War, succeeded in freeing her on condition that she never set foot in the Caucasus, Moscow, or St. Petersburg. She pursued medicine in Kharkov, Ukraine, and in 1912 moved to Siberia, where Ohanjanyan was sentenced to 4 years. They married in the fateful year of 1915. Rubina served in hospitals near the battle lines and witnessed the birth of the First Republic of Armenia in 1918, and her husband becoming prime minister months before Sovietization in 1920. After a short stay in Iran, they settled in Cairo. After Ohanjanyan's death in 1947, Rubina lived in Montreal close to her only son until her death in 1971 at the age of 90. Always modest about her revolutionary role, Rubina's response to the bestowing of the honor of Princess of Cilicia in 1968 by Catholicos Choren of the Great House of Cilicia was, "What have I done anyway? Yes inchem arelvor." Thank you.
Thank you, dear Huri. Fascinating chapter and a fascinating life story. I would like to move forward with our next speaker, and this is my colleague and friend Ramazan Hakko Ashton. He's an assistant professor at the of history at Atatürk Institute for Modern Turkish History at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Ramazan Öztan completed his PhD in May 2016 at the University of Utah under the supervision of Peter Sluglet, and was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Neuchâtel, where he worked in an ERC, European Research Council project, on the borders of the interwar Middle East. He has published articles in past and present, 2 articles in International Journal of Middle East Studies, Journal of Contemporary History, and Journal of Migration History. As you have all heard now, he is the co-editor of Age of Rogues, Rebels, Revolutionaries, and Racketeers at the Frontiers of Empires, published this year. And also coming with Edinburgh University Press, he is the co-editor of another edited volume titled Regimes of Mobility, Borders and State Formation in the Middle East, 1918-1949, co-edited with Jordi Tegel, who was also a contributor to our volume, coming soon in 2022. Ramazan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alp, for the kind introduction. And also I'd like to thank Professor Berberian for putting this event together. And before I start talking about this elusive figure known to Fikchev, I'd like to just make few remarks, actually, how I bumped into him. Back in 2014, it must be, I was in the archives, and I was really obsessed with the Ottoman bureaucratic records on the spread of bombs, weapons, revolutionaries, how they travel, how they exchange illicit literature, etc. And this really became a topic of mine, and I really dedicated my dissertation research to this. And I thought at the time that there weren't really many people doing research on this particular niche topic. And later on, of course, I met Huri Berberian, and I think it was a conference in Dublin. And to my delight, I discovered that she was working on a similar thing, even though focusing on the Armenian revolutionaries and looking at sort of the Caucasus and Iran and Eastern Anatolia. And of course, my research ended up focusing on the Balkans. And now Fikchev also hails from the Balkans. But the fact that I'll be talking about Macedonia and Bulgaria, it shouldn't mean that I'm just going to talk about this particular geography, as was noted in the introduction by Alp. This was, at the end of the day, these frontiers of the empires, they were very much connected, and many of these actors that we describe, they constantly crisscross and they really navigate these networks. And as such, Bulgaria wasn't really just relevant for Bulgarian revolutionaries or Macedonian revolutionaries, but surprisingly, it was also a very important place for Armenian revolutionaries and also young Turks, particularly in accessing certain tools of revolution, let's say, or technologies of violence, such as bombs and rifles and experts. And speaking of experts, Naum Fikchev was one such individual who really stood at what one may call this heart of revolutionary cross-fertilization. And in what follows, I'll just briefly talk about his biography. I'm just going to give some highlights. His life is quite complicated. I've been researching him for around 5-6 years now, and he's not someone who was really higher up in the political hierarchy, right? And thus, of course, his life was a bit elusive. He was more of a middleman, an expert, a bomb maker. And as such, it really took quite a bit of time really to put together different anecdotes, different evidence together, and sort of to reconstruct his life and the important roles he played actually in the late Ottoman revolutionary culture. Okay, here we start. Here you have the picture of Naum Fikchev to your right. He was born in 1864 in Ottoman Macedonia, and when he was a teenager, actually, he witnessed the outbreak of the war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. And this was a war that really ravaged the whole region. And now Tufekçi and his family was one of those who really had to really immigrate, and thus they were part of this larger Macedonian migration away from the Ottoman Macedonia into Bulgaria. So as such, when they came to Bulgaria, Tufekçi, he was actually part of this larger Macedonian diaspora there. And Bulgaria, of course, at the time, it was this newly autonomous region with a new leadership. And of course, for these new national leaders who were themselves former revolutionaries, who came from this larger tradition of Bulgarian revolution, for them, it was really important to have an independent Bulgaria, right? And of course, these Macedonian refugees, when they came and settled in Bulgaria, they really constitute this constituency that they really wanted to tap into. And individuals like Tufekçi, for example, in one fashion, he was chosen to be sent abroad to study sciences with scholarships from Sofia. And he accordingly actually went to Belgium and attended the University of Liège, where he studied sciences. And he was supposed to come back and actually work for the Bulgarian army. But as I said, this new leadership in Bulgaria, they really wanted to pursue a bit more independent politics, let's say. And of course, Russia, that really helped Bulgaria to gain autonomy and break away from the Ottomans. Russia really wanted to, continue its influence and perhaps keep Bulgaria as a buffer state, right? A state that it could control. And thus, within a few years, there was this really growing tension between Russia and the Bulgarian authorities in Sofia. And as such, this wasn't necessarily just a political game. This also involved violence. Actually, in 1886, Russia engineered a coup d'etat in order to topple this independent Bulgarian regime in Sofia, but the coup actually failed. And after the failure of the coup, of course, everyone knew that Russia was behind the coup. We see that the leadership in Sofia really starts to crack down on anyone that they deemed as pro-Russian. And that included many Macedonians for whom Russian help was key in also securing the political future of Macedonia and perhaps making Macedonia autonomous also within the Ottoman Empire. And as such, we see that many Macedonian refugees who were politically active, they were put in jail, or the individuals or many of them also escaped Bulgaria, or individuals such as Tufekçi who were actually abroad. That meant that they couldn't go back to Bulgaria. And the politically active among these Macedonians, they focused their activities in these three cities that I wrote down here: Odessa, Belgrade, and Constantinople. And this is where they really started hatching conspiracies and also most probably receiving some help from the Russian government. And they continued really to sort of try to strike back and topple this independent regime in Sofia. And the way this happened, I've also mentioned this age of assassinations, and thus here we have quite a few of them, and Tufekçi really played quite central roles. The first time that Macedonians really struck back and tried to get back at this leadership that they defined as moderate in Sofia, not radical enough, it was in 1891 when they tried to kill Stambolov, who was the prime minister of Bulgaria at the time. And the hitman actually included the younger brother of Tufekçi. The assassination sort of failed because they mistakenly killed Hristo Belge, who was the minister of finance, who was just next to Stambolov. They thought that was Stambolov, apparently they really looked alike. But then Dencho Tufekçi was actually caught, and he was put in jail and actually tortured to death. So in addition to all the political ideals and beliefs that his older brother, Naum Tufekçi, had, now Naum Tufekçi also had a personal reason to seek revenge from this moderate leadership. And of course, this first assassination attempt, it really caused some troubles between Bulgaria and Serbia, because Serbia, remember, was where some of these Macedonians were running cells. So it really created this intense interstate episode. And when you look at the records, you can see that the authorities in Bulgaria, they knew that another assassination was in the making, but then they weren't really sure whom the Macedonians were going to target and where, and they really suspected again another hit on Stambolov or on the Prince Ferdinand, but this didn't take place, but actually the assassination took place in Istanbul in February 1892, targeting this time the Bulgarian representative to Constantinople, Dr. Vukovic, who was seen by Macedonians as yet another Bulgarian nationalist politician who was seen as too moderate. Tufekçev actually came to Istanbul and stayed in this building, the building on the right. Actually, the top floor was a church, it still is. He stayed there and he actually passed through the customs under the protection of the Russian consulates, which also shows you this link with Russia and with the pro-Russian faction. He stayed there, he masterminded the whole episode, but then he left before the assassination took place, and he actually went to Odessa. And thus, that was a successful assassination attempt. But this didn't mean that the situation, the political atmosphere in Bulgaria was really tranquil. This was absolutely not the case. We start seeing the start of disagreements within the leadership in Sofia, particularly this ongoing competition between the prime minister and the prince himself. The Prince Ferdinand no longer wanted to be just a figurehead. He really wanted to be part of politics, and he really wanted to remove Stambolov from power. And finally, actually, Stambolov resigns. And immediately after he resigns, we see that the pro-Russian faction really started taking over. We see that Macedonians who were kept at prison, they were released from prison, and thus and also Tufekçev himself, actually, the moment the atmosphere, the political atmosphere shifts in Sofia, we see that he also comes back to Sofia from Odessa. And the moment he arrives, he starts becoming really active in revolutionary politics. He meets with his former comrades. They form new organizations. They compete against one another. This is this is the contentious politics of the day. And then he also becomes the vice president of this one particular committee. But this doesn't mean that the assassinations stop. This was already alluded, I think, in Alp's presentation too. And Tufekçev becomes part of this larger conspiracy, and then they organize the assassination of the former prime minister of Bulgaria, Stefan Stambolov. Here you can see on the right the picture of a statue that exists today in Sofia, and of course his head is cracked open, and thus it was Tufekçev's network that really carried this act out. But the fact that Tufekçev was back in Sofia, and the fact that his name got really publicly linked to this assassination attempt meant that he couldn't really take on the responsibilities of leadership within the existing revolutionary organizations in Sofia. So from this point onwards, we see that actually Tufekçev really emerges less as a conspirator, but more as an expert who starts manufacturing bombs. And he has complicated relationship with the government. At certain time, he has support of Sofia in manufacturing bombs. At certain times, he loses this support. But then he really makes up for this by building transnational connections. And for the first time, actually, we see that the Armenian revolutionaries were invited to Bulgaria to exchange expertise in manufacturing these small hand bombs, the precursors of grenades. And we see that the Armenian revolutionaries, particularly this chemist named Grigor, he stayed in Bulgaria for about a year, and he ran this workshop, and then he exchanged this technology with his Macedonian comrades. And Tufekçev really played some role in putting these people into contact. But then this workshop was shut down pretty quickly. And then on the side, Tufekçev continued to manufacture bombs, and actually he sold bombs to Macedonian revolutionaries who operated inside the Ottoman Empire up until 1903. After 1903, we see that Tufekçev really expands his business. He wasn't just limited to putting people in contact or manufacturing bombs for, let's say, regional clients that were just operating down south inside the Ottoman Empire. We see that actually he starts having this larger transnational clientele. Particularly, he starts helping out the Russian Social Democrats because there was this one period before the Constitutional Revolution in Russia in 1905 when the Bolsheviks were also experimenting with tactics of terror. And we see that some of these individuals, for instance, this Omega, he's a chemist. He comes to Sofia and starts actually picking up, the ways through which they can, manufacture these bombs. Tvekhchev also meets with high figure Bolsheviks in Paris. He goes bomb shopping with them. Literally, this is the case. They really try different fuses, different explosives. He's really there exchanging his expertise, but also obviously making money out of this. And it's not just a matter of selling weapons or manufacturing or the knowledge of manufacturing bombs, but he also becomes an important intermediary in the larger trade of weapons that's taking place at this time. For example, Maxim Litvinov, he spent 1906 collecting weaponry in Europe, buying from different factories, etc. And then these weapons were supposed to be shipped to Caucasus to be used in the revolutionary struggles there. And of course, Tvekhchev emerged again as an important actor who cleared out the Bulgarian customs for these shipments to be made. Unfortunately, the ship actually ran ashore and then just off the shore of Romania at the time. So he was, and this story continues. Tvekhchev played other roles in the upcoming years, and he really had a tight relationship with the Bolsheviks and with the Russians. And we see that in 1905, and in fact in 1904 to 1905, he maintained also close contacts with Armenian revolutionaries. Of course, Professor Berberian already alluded to this. Tvekhchev was the one actually who sold the ARF the melanite that they needed for the assassination attempt in 1905. And here is actually a letter, his correspondence with the Armenian revolutionaries, where you can see that, he says that he received this check in exchange for this 400 kilos of melanite. It doesn't say melanite, but it says M in the letter. And he says that actually right after I got the check, someone also came and actually picked up melanite. And now it's off to the destination, and destination is, of course, Istanbul. And of course, this picture is it's the courtesy of Professor Berberian herself. Okay, so at this point, really, Tvekhchev emerged as this businessman, selling bombs not just to local revolutionaries operating in the Balkans, but also to all these transnational revolutionary non-state actors. After 1908. We see that actually Tvekhchev is one of those revolutionaries that fought so hard to topple the regime. We see that now they're all joining the revolution and coming down to the Balkans. And Tvekhchev was one such individual who visited the Ottoman, or visited his hometown for the first time since he had left for Bulgaria. He comes, he actually meets with famous Young Turk leaders, one of which is, of course, Enver Bey, whom I also alluded to in his presentation. And here's actually a postcard that Enver Bey himself signed as a souvenir of the revolution of 1908, given directly to Tvekhchev. And the one on top is the letterhead of his company, Tvekhchev's company. As I said, Tvekhchev comes to Ottoman Empire. He actually becomes a member of the Young Turk organization. He starts paying dues to the organization after 1908. He really starts building his relationships. And as you can see, he has this tight relationship with Enver Bey in particular. But then we see that then the Balkan Wars break out. And this was really a tense period in the relationship between the Ottomans and Bulgaria. But right after the Balkan Wars, we see that this period of rapprochement starts between the two countries. And Tvekhchev emerges as one actor who really pushes for rapprochement with Istanbul, and actually slowly he turns into this former revolutionary turned diplomat. And he starts cultivating these relationships with the Young Turk leaders, who are then preparing slowly for the First World War. And we see that after the breakout of the war, of the First World War, Bulgaria still stays neutral for a year or so. And Tvekhchev is the one who really pushes, or who tries to shape the Bulgarian public opinion through revolutionary actions so that Bulgaria can join the war on the side of Germany and the Ottoman Empire. And as such, this individual who just a few decades ago, who was involved in these assassination attempts, who sold bombs, who has this quite radical past, let's say, is sitting here and concluding, as you can see in this picture to the right, this treaty, which actually is which signals the alliance between Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. So it sort of shows you how revolutionaries can also turn into sort of diplomats. And they're sitting here in the room of the Ministry of War, together with these famous young Turks, Talat and Enver Bey and Halil Bey. And of course, the First World War, it wasn't just an opportunity for individuals like Tvekhchev to pursue diplomatic paths. After all, he was a businessman, and of course, he was involved in the sale of bombs, this time directly to the Ottoman army, and also he was involved in many other trades, such as selling wool cloth, hand grenades, etc. And here I just put up sort of a depiction of his bomb design. The one you see on top, the round one, is the sort of the hand grenade, the Tvekhchev model number 1330, and then the one below, the square one, is the bomb that will be used in trenches. And of course, you see the soldiers, the Ottoman soldiers in the picture on the right, where you see that the first soldier is holding two of those hand grenades together with this match rectangular on his left shoulder, which is used to light the bomb. So you see that his bombs, or his bomb designs, that were once functional for the revolutionaries are now actually sort of slowly seeping into the ranks of conventional warfare. Here I'll slowly conclude, and I'm running out of time. Perfect. What are some of the larger themes that pop up out of this really complex biography? First of all, I think displacement and refugees and diaspora networks and hometown networks, they were really significant for revolutionary conduct. The individual, the way in which actually Tvekhchev can put together teams of assassins in Istanbul, let's say, it really spoke to these hometown networks. And the ways in which Tvekhchev could do business, could pursue business in Bulgaria with Macedonian revolutionaries. It again really spoke to the resilience of the Macedonian diaspora in Bulgaria. And of course, education is out there. That, you know, here was a refugee who came from a poor background, but then who really climbed up the social ladder through higher education. And because of the expertise and know-how that he gained over the course of his career, we see that actually this technical know-how really made him an indispensable figure in the late Ottoman revolutionary culture. And I forgot to mention, by the way, the story stops in the First World War because he was actually assassinated in front of his house by a faction that was closer to Russia. Perhaps there was no other appropriate way for someone like Tvekhchev to die than being shot down, even though he had two bodyguards next to him. But of course, his biography also, I think, really highlight this point that Alp also made in his introduction, the significance of these interstate rivalries, these imperial rivalries. Tvekhchev was someone who really navigated these networks really well. He was really close to Russia. He received Russian support. He really benefited from this. This theme is also very strongly out there. But I think the benefits of following the biographies of such individuals is really, it really shows us the extent of individual agency out there. We often talk about larger structural transformations, the importance of backgrounds, let's say, how it shapes things. But really, at some point, it's this individual agency that really pushes them, right? That it's really out there. I think I really like to highlight that as my last point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Ramazan. Impressive presentation. Again, a very impressive biography, Chief Chef. And I'm moving on to our last speaker on our panel, Toygun Altıntaş. He penned the chapter, the Abode of Sedition, Resistance, Repression, and Revolution in Sasson, 1891, 1904. Toygun is currently a fellow of the Europe in Middle East and Middle East in Europe network of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation at Forum Transregionale Studien in Berlin. And he's also affiliated with the Global History at the Free University of Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. So he primarily works on the social and political history of minoritization, supremacism, and inequality in late Ottoman Empire, but also on questions of gender violence and support. He received his MA in 2010 in Middle Eastern Studies and his PhD in 2008 in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, entitled Crisis and Disorder, Armenian Revolutionaries and the Hamiltian Regime in the Ottoman Empire, 1887-1896. His dissertation explores the spread of Armenian revolutionary committees and the contemporaneous minoritization of Armenians by the Ottoman state. It also investigates the processes by which boundaries of subjecthood and nationality for Armenians were constructed and constricted during the reign of Sultan Abdulhamid II. Toygun, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alp. I'd also like to thank Huri again for inviting me to speak on the panel, and of course, Alp and Ramazan for compiling this volume. I'm going to share my screen very quickly, if I can do that. Yes, I think it's working. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about one of the frontiers that Alp and Ramazan wrote about in their introductions. And the region is Sassun, which might be familiar to some people in the audience, as it's very much the stuff of legends among the Armenian revolutionary movement. And I want to talk about how this remote mountainous district became one of the earlier sites of struggle between the Armenian revolutionary movement and the Ottoman state, and really one of the first laboratories where the Hamiltian regime really started to construct its new and more rigid regime of ethnicity in the Ottoman Empire. I want to start by talking a little bit about the region itself and the people that lived in it at the time that I'm going to be focusing on, which is roughly the 15 years between 1890 and 1905. Sassun is located west of Lake Van. It's a very mountainous region. It was, at the time, it was primarily inhabited by Armenian peasants and some Kurdish peasants as well. The Kurdish pastoralist tribes from the province of Diyarbakir also summered in the pastures of Sassun until, as far as we can tell, until the 1870s or so, when local authorities imposed a ban because their sort of summers ventures into Sassun resulted in frequent clashes between the peasants and the pastoralists. And this theme is quite important for two reasons. First, because animal husbandry was one of the main sources of livelihood in this region. It was very crucial for the survival of its inhabitants. And two, because this really was one of the first, this tradition of armed clashes between pastoralists and peasants was one of the main reasons why both revolutionaries and the state really gained interest in this region, because the peasants, for the most part, were Armenian, and the pastoralists, for the most part, were Kurdish. Another aspect that I want to talk about here is that there was a network of tributary relations in Sassoon. And by that, I mean most of the peasants in the region paid some kind of tribute, mostly in kind, to a small group of Kurdish lords in exchange for protection. And protection, both in the sense of a protection racket, but also really in terms of protection from outsiders. And those outsiders included both these kinds of pastoralist tribes who might want to summer in using the pastures of Sassoon, or it might include the Ottoman state. And as we'll see, until the 1890s, very few of the Armenian peasants in Sassoon actually paid direct taxes to the state. Most of their tribute went to these Kurdish lords, who essentially would claim to Ottoman officials themselves that the Armenians were their subjects and they had a right to collect tribute and taxes from them. One final feature I want to talk about is that's related to this tradition of armed clashes between Armenian peasants and Kurdish pastoralists, is that this resulted in the creation of this image of the Sassoon Armenian as this warlike martial peasant. This was quite important because for Armenian revolutionaries in the early 1890s, Sassoon became a site both of possible organization, but also a place to draw inspiration from. So that's why in 1892, shortly after the formation of the two leading Armenian revolutionary parties, that is the Hınçakyan Social Democratic Party and the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Mihran Damadyan, who was a member of the Hınçakyan Party at the time, went to Sassoon. And in Sassoon, he formed an armed band of primarily local recruits, and they donned a sort of distinctive headgear, a distinctive clothes in order to differentiate themselves from the otherwise also armed population of the region, and started to both assist the Armenian peasants in their clashes and struggles against the pastoralists, but also tried to push them and organize them for action against government officials as well. For the most part, we can say that at least in 1892 and 1893, their efforts were not very successful. Mihran Damadyan, while he was in Sassoon, also authored this some 100-page long book of poems and songs, which we now have in the Ottoman archives because he would later be captured, in which he explored themes about the necessity for armed struggle, the ethics of a revolutionary and how a revolutionary should live, and also about particular episodes of injustice and violence against Armenians. So the infamous case of Gülizar is mentioned in one of his poems, as is the massacre of Armenian peasants in a village called Vartenis, for example. So this it's likely, and I'm guessing a little bit here, but it's likely that this book was meant to be transported out of Sassoon to a nearby urban center from which it could be disseminated amongst Armenians. Like I said, Mihran Damadyan was captured in 1893 by government gendarmes. And this was really a turning point in the history of the region, because after his initial interrogation in Mush, he was immediately sent to Istanbul for further questioning. And the reason for that was because, and I can talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, this was a time period, the early 1890s, where it was a time period that the Ottoman government had already become increasingly suspicious of the Armenian revolutionary project, but also of its Armenian population at large. In other words, the question of Armenian reform that had grown out of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 essentially made any kind of agitation in favor of Armenians, or the sort of the public pronunciation of Armenian grievances, suspect and in most cases criminal in the Ottoman Empire. And for that reason, Damadyan was immediately sent to Istanbul, where he was interrogated again, and he became a sort of semi-informant. And by that I mean he refused to name his close collaborators in Sassoon and Mush, but he agreed to provide the government with information on various revolutionary circles outside the Ottoman Empire. And for this, he was given a sort of sinecurial position in the Ottoman Postal Service, from which he would later flee the empire and again engage in a range of political activities. But his testimony and his acknowledgement that there was a revolutionary group in Sassoon convinced the Ottoman Sultan, Abdülhamid II, to organize a military expedition. And this really was a euphemism, but rather the collective punishment of Sassoon Armenians, at least the section of Sassoon where Dalmatian was captured. In 1894, hundreds of Ottoman soldiers were dispatched to Sassoon around the same time as Kurdish pastoralists from the south also gathered in search for pastures. And in the late summer of 1894, the Ottoman army marched on Sassoon, and upon seeing the Ottoman army, the peasants fled fled into the heights of the mountains around. And according to most reliable estimates, about 1,000 peasants were massacred as the Ottoman army torched the villages, and for about 2.5 weeks to 3 weeks, or sort of engaged in various search and destroy missions among the countryside. And this was a brutal process that really continued until a military officer in Mush, who was responsible for maintaining communication between Istanbul and also the officers on the ground, decided to report to the palace that massacres of civilians without arms were also taking place after they had sought protection from the army. After this, the operation was quickly concluded, and perhaps in a most telling fashion, the revolutionaries themselves, most of them were captured alive. So most of almost the entire population that was killed during the massacre were the peasants. And this was really in accordance with the original orders of the palace, which were to teach a powerful lesson to all Armenians. Of course, I can't say that this, I can't say with certainty that this meant massacre all the Armenians that are in Sassoon, but it was clear that this meant a collective punishment with extensive violence. So news of this massacre very quickly spread, and one of the reasons for this was a wave of refugees from Sassoon to nearby towns and cities like Mush and Bitlis. But another reason was the fact that some of the Kurdish pastoralists who had served as guides or as auxiliary units during this episode openly talked about what had occurred. When they went back to their wintering grounds, when they went back to markets in those places like Silvan, Siirt, Diyarbakir, they openly talked about what had happened. And as a result, there was considerable international pressure on the Ottoman government from the late months of 1894. In early 1895, the Sultan was forced to accept the creation of an investigative commission, which would be composed of Ottoman officials, but also would be observed by representatives of the three great powers, that is France, Britain, and Russia, who were recognized as the interested parties in issues related to the Armenian question. The work of the investigative commission was very contradictory, because on the one hand, the Ottoman government gave very clear instructions and maintained a daily communication with members of this commission to make sure that its narrative, which was that there was a revolution, there was a sort of attempted rebellion in Sassoon, which the Ottoman army suppressed in an orderly manner without harming any civilians. They wanted to make sure that this narrative would be propagated by most of the witnesses. On the other hand, of course, many of the witnesses were survivors of the massacre themselves. So they came forward and talked about their experiences in the presence of these diplomatic observers. And as a result, it became clear that the sort of the narrative that the Ottoman government wanted to construct, and which in some cases actually they altered the reports of military officers who had participated in this operation, really did not reach their intended consequence. In other words, British diplomats, Russian diplomats, French diplomats, everybody in there, at least the British, as far as I found in my research, but also the international public opinion was quite heavily convinced that a massacre had taken place. But for a variety of reasons, I won't have the time to get into, the Ottoman government was successful in withstanding this pressure and did not punish any of the perpetrators of this massacre, and continued to refrain from enacting the reforms that had been promised some 20 years ago at the Treaty of Berlin. Because I don't have too much, I don't want to take too much of your time, I won't talk extensively about the more minute relationship between the Ottoman state and Kurdish lords on the ground in Sassun. But I just want to, just to give you a kind of general overview of what that was like during this period, I want to say that the Ottoman state punished Kurdish lords in Sassun who wanted to maintain this kind of traditional tributary relationship that I talked about by imprisoning them or by pushing them to the margins. And they rewarded Kurdish lords who helped the Ottoman state in its pursuit of Armenian revolutionaries, and who also then used their newly gained power to extort Armenian peasants for their own favor. And this was really a pattern that would be extended throughout most of the rest of Ottoman Armenia during this period. But it was really, there are some stark examples of this taking place in Sassun. I'll just say that. But because of this sort of more aggressive attitude that the Ottoman state, and the more immediately aggressive attitude that the Ottoman state assumed against the Armenians of Sassun, the revolutionaries after 1895 and 1896 found a much more fertile ground for their propaganda and for organizing among the Armenians of Sassun. Because the peasants were convinced that the revolutionaries were interested in their defense. The peasants were also drawn to the revolutionaries' cause by the revolutionaries' success in smuggling weapons into this region. And also the revolutionaries extended their sort of range of operations to include government officials and the Kurdish lords who collaborated with the state. And perhaps one of the most famous examples of one of these revolutionaries is Andanik Ozanyan, who was in Sassun at the time, and who, after a Kurdish lord organized a sort of massacre of Armenian peasants in a village, he waylaid that Kurdish lord and killed him, and took his medal, which you can see here on his shoulder, which apparently was a decoration he had received from Istanbul as sort of recognition for his services to the imperial throne. Because of the success of the revolutionaries in Sassun, at least the relative success of the revolutionaries in Sassun, the Central Committee of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation decided to organize an open insurrection in Sassun and draw attention again to the Armenian question on an international level. This took place in 1904, and the Armenian revolutionaries this time were a lot more successful than they had been in the earlier periods, and they succeeded in securing the support of some hundreds of peasants as well in organizing this armed rebellion. The revolutionaries torched a couple of Muslim villages that were close to what they wanted to designate as the center of the rebellion, ostensibly because the Muslims of those villages had been collaborating with the state. And in response, the Ottoman government, afraid that international intervention, which had taken place in previous cases, would take place again, organized a sort of early military response. So in March 1904, Ottoman armies invaded Sassun again. And after 2 to 3 weeks of armed clashes and some pitched battles, which was a very different kind of scenario than what had occurred in 1894, the rebels were defeated, and the army again pushed the revolutionaries out of the region with a considerable degree of violence, also committed against the peasants again. At that point, the Ottoman authorities entertained two possible quote-unquote solutions to this problem of Sassun turning into what one official called the abode of sedition. And one solution was to drive all Armenians from Sassun and settle them in the Mush plain. This was, although initially favored, this was not realized, partially because of the difficulties of enforcing this kind of forced settlement, but also because of the kind of international reaction that it would provoke. The second option was the construction of a series of military outposts and barracks in the region in order to create a permanent military presence. And this was the option that the Ottomans ended up implementing in 1905. Before I conclude, I want to draw attention to a couple of the, I think, couple of issues that come out of this kind of process. And one of them is the fact that the Ottoman state was very actively involved in reshaping reshaping relations among communities in Sassun. You know, in 1890, an Ottoman official who was surveying the region wrote a detailed report in which he said that the Kurds and Armenians of Sassun are very much alike, that the Kurds also use Armenian words in their daily speech. They show respect towards Armenian clergymen. And he wrote about this with a considerable degree of suspicion and unease. In other words, he was suggesting that this was not a good thing. This did not bode well for the extension of Ottoman state control into this region. And he proposed that that Kurdish he wrote Muslim primacy in the region be promoted. The second issue I want to talk about relates to the revolutionaries and what made their actions popular for the Sassun Armenians. And I think they only became successful in drawing the support of this rural population after they committed themselves to engaging in episodes of violence that were immediately responsive to the grievances of Sassun Armenians. In other words, this kind of what we might call retribution or revenge kind of violence, it really seems to have succeeded, along, of course, with the fact that the Ottoman state had committed an extreme amount of violence in the region in 1894, drew Armenians in Sassun to these revolutionary groups. Before I take much more of your time, I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Toygun, and I believe Huri Barbarian from here again.
Yes, thank you, Toygun. Thank you, Ramazan. Thank you, Alp. Toygun, is there a way for you to stop sharing screen so we can all return?
Yeah, there we go. Sorry.
In full view. Thank you. Okay, so we are ready to accept any and all questions. If you could type them in, if you haven't already done so. Yes, I don't see any questions yet, but if any of the panelists have any questions or comments, you're welcome to start us off. Oop.
I can ask perhaps Toigon a little bit. So I
Yes.
think now there is, together with your research, Owen Miller and I believe Ilkay Yilmaz also approaching this period. So there's kind of a growing interest in the Armenian massacres of 1890s and then this kind of Hamidian period. So I think, perhaps you can say something a little bit about this, how this is relevant for Armenian studies in general terms, and also in the study of the Armenian genocide. This is kind of looking into this, the Hamidian period, and instead of the Young Turk period as such.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of research coming out about the Hamidian massacres, and also a lot of research recently on the social and political history of Ottoman Armenians, both in the Hamidian period and before. And I think this is really important because in the older historiography, the Hamidian period was mostly sort of alluded to as a prelude to the genocide, and as a kind of period when extreme violence was committed against Armenians, and this sort of anticipated the genocide that was going to take place from 1915 onwards. Whereas now, I think a lot of research is showing that that the kind of violence enacted upon Armenians in the 1890s was not the result of some kind of blind fanaticism or simply the end product of a sultan. You know, Abdulhamid II was portrayed as this kind of sole organizer of these massacres and the kind of regime that enacted them. I think the research is showing that this was very much related to Ottoman modernization, to its contradictions, to its problems since the 1830s onwards, and also related to global processes that we might also think of as, if you think about the 1865, the emancipations of slaves in the United States, again in the 1860s, the abolition of serfdom in the Russian Empire, and the extension of limited rights to Jews in the Russian Empire. We see that similar processes were taking place in the Ottoman Empire in those periods towards non-Muslims. And from the late 1870s onwards, a different kind of set of strategies are being deployed, not necessarily as a result of one man's planning, but really as a means of constructing a new administration and a new regime. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. It's quite exciting, and and we're moving away from this kind of teleological understanding of the earlier periods. So that to me is also very promising. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for Ramazan. Ramazan, I have come across in the ARF archives, specifically, I think it was in the Congress in 1907 when the RF was discussing who was at fault and trying to find out what exactly had happened, why it had failed, and so forth. There were accusations or certain claims were made that the melanite that Tufekchiev had provided was not clean or pure, or so. Can you comment on that? Have you seen anything of that sort in other places?
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the question. Of course, the technical aspect of manufacturing bombs, etc., it was something that I sort of started exposing myself to, not out of choice, but just because of studying the topic. And I have to say, I don't really know much about these, assets or these, minute details of the, what it means to shift from one technology to the next. So I don't really have a immediate answer to your question. At the end of the day, I mean, the bombs went off, right? I mean, that's the. Perhaps what I can say is that the reason why experts like Tufekçiev can survive through the ebbs and flows of all these quite radical lives is in part because they're really rare, and revolutionary organizations really need them. I think this is really something that comes out of it. And because when we look at the late 19th century, up until a time, like, first of all, dynamite needed to get stabilized before it could have been used. And it had been always a very risky endeavor to really use it, all these explosive materials. And that's why, like, individuals like Michelian's story of accidentally killing himself with this explosion, it's not unique, but actually representative. So that's why I think the technology itself wasn't necessarily very reliable. If I'm not mistaken, up until 1890s, it wasn't fully stabilized, these technologies. I think in 1880s, like up until then, the train companies, they refused to carry them because they were unstable. So I think all these technical questions really coexisted with these notions of expertise, and it was always a risky business. And but perhaps the uncertainty of chemicals also, as you suggested, really fed into these intra-committee rivalries, debates, etc.
We have one question from the audience, and this is I will try to rephrase it. It's for Huri Berberian. It's a question about the Rubina. So this is so kind of how far the backlash she received or faced from her revolutionary colleagues was because she's a woman, and it's kind of the counter, let's say, because it was indeed a kind of a failed assassination, very complicated, very challenging. Would a man would have been treated differently? A failed man would have been treated differently in such a situation by fellow comrades?
I think a large part of it was because she was a woman. On the other hand, when we look at the conclusions that the ARF investigative body reached regarding the failed attempt, in the end, they chose not to find her at fault, but found her, the leader of the responsible body, Sappho, at fault, and his comrades at fault for the failed attempt. Now, that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that it was because they saw her equal to her male comrades. That was largely because of her relationship to Christopor and the other co-founders of the ARF. And for them to save her reputation meant that they were also saving the reputation of Christopor Mikaelian, because Sappho was actually had not just led a failed assassination attempt, but he had also actively gone against Mikaelian after Mikaelian's death in finding fault with him. And this was a leader, a co-founder of the party, and the party could not stand for that. And so there was gender definitely involved in the backlash in terms of what she was getting from Sappho and her comrades. All of that, hysteria, that she was hysterical, that she would faint at everything that, bothered her. I mean, really, it seems a little ridiculous, but, and then to have her get in the carriage. Anyway, But that, yes, that definitely was about gender. But I think in the case of the decision that was made in the end, that had to do that was about a lot about other things more so than gender. And I talk about this in the article if the person is interested in looking at the details.
A question out of curiosity about this. So was the women's question dealt differently among, let's say, Hunchak revolutionaries and Tashnak revolutionaries? Was there a kind of a differentiation, like approach to the women's question in different revolutionary factions? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, in principle, I would think so, because one of the founders of the Hunchak party was a woman. But in reality, I don't know if that's the case. One of the problems we have is that there are no Hunchak archives. The information that we have, the documents that we have are all over the place. So unlike the treasure that now that it's being opened up, that the ARF archives are, we don't have such a treasure with the Hunchaks. And so I don't have myself enough information. I also haven't done the research, and perhaps someone who has can speak to that. But I would suspect that if there was a difference, the difference was slight. I can't imagine that there was a huge difference in the way they treated women or the way they perceived gender.
Thank you.
I can quickly ask something to Toygun. Of course, Huri was describing like how after this assassination attempt, there was this intra-committee discussion about, what happened, etc. Was there a similar thing after Sassoon? Like, how did the revolutionaries themselves see it? Did they discuss it, or were there debates, or?
So the literature I've looked at is mostly the revolutionary organ of the Hunchakian Social Democratic Party at the time, and their response was there was no public discussion of any kind of revolutionary failure that might have taken place, because in 1890 until the middle of the 1890s, the ascendant revolutionary organization, at least active in Sassoon, was the Hunchakian Social Democratic Party. We see that after the failures, not only of Sassoon necessarily, but really of the Hamidian massacres from 1895, from the fall of 1895 onwards, and the fact that again, the promise of reforms turns out to be false, then there seems to be a shift. Many people, being the very same people, shifting from the Hunchakian Social Democratic Party to the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. I'm sure in some cases ideological issues were relevant also, but I think at that point organizational matters really took precedence for many people. And also, just to add to the issue of the women's question, I also have not focused on this issue as far as the attitude of revolutionary parties is concerned. But one thing I can say about depictions of violence, like sexual violence against Armenian women in the publications that I've seen, usually focus on the refusal of the Armenian women to continue their life in the face of such unspeakable violence. So in the case of Sassoon, for example, there's lots of references to Armenian women committing suicide rather than surrendering themselves to the Ottoman soldiers. And at the commission that I mentioned, perhaps the most striking accounts of the violence committed against Sassoon Armenians came from the women who survived, and many of them described episodes of sexual violence that was committed against them. And this was really it's clear from the transcripts of this commission that this was a very tense moment. The Ottoman officials tried to prevent these women from actually coming out and talking about their experiences. And also, it's clear that it had a huge impact on the observers, the diplomatic observers who were there, against whom the Ottoman officials had nothing to say. I mean, they could blame a lot of the men as having participated in like armed clashes against soldiers, even though there was no evidence of such a thing. They could claim such things, but with women, they didn't know what to do. And it really was. So I can say that the revolutionaries, the revolutionary accounts of sexual violence and so on, do not talk about these developments, even though it played a major role in I think in making sure that both European public opinion, but also European diplomats hear of what happened there.
We are nearing 11:30. I'm open to other questions if you guys would like to continue this, or we could wrap it up. And shall we wrap it up? It's late where you are. Okay. I want to thank you very much for joining me today and for putting together such an excellent book. And I hope that our audience will make sure to buy that book. The link to it, there it is. The link to the book is on chat. I would have to go to the other room, but I do have a copy. The link to the book is in chat. You can also, of course, get it from other booksellers online, not just Edinburgh Press. It was a pleasure working with all of you. I hope we get opportunities to collaborate again. And thank you for everyone for attending. And for those of you who stayed to the very end, thank you to you as well. And this has been recorded and will be on our YouTube channel in the next week or two. So we'll let you know, and you can spread the word about the recording as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, dear Harry. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.